I ara és un plaer presentar la següent ponent, Geers, professora investigadora de la Universitat de Texas, en Dallas, Estats Units. La doctora Geers és una psicòloga del desenvolupament reconeguda mundialment pels seus estudis en l'adquisició del llenguatge i la parla en infants amb pèrdua auditiva. Ha publicat més de 100 articles i capítols de llibres i ha presentat els seus treballs en múltiples congressos mundials. Entre els treballs de recerca més coneguts destaca un projecte finançat pel National Health Institute dels Estats Units en el que va estudiar el desenvolupament dels infants després de la implantació coclear amb un seguiment de més de 100 infants durant 10 anys i això fet a diverses zones dels Estats Units. En la presentació d'avui, la doctora Geers ens explicarà en les primeres diapositives la motivació del seu estudi quan va llegir un treball publicat a 2015 per altres autors en el que es preguntaven si tots els infants amb sordesa haurien d'aprendre llengua de signes. I la doctora Geers va voler investigar en aquest sentit comparant diverses maneres d'exposició del llenguatge, només amb llengua oral o incorporant llengua de signes. La doctora Geers ens presentarà avui com a partir del seu treball longitudinal amb aquests 100 infants va obtenir la conclusió significativa dels beneficis de la llengua oral per promoure el desenvolupament verbal i escrit de qualitat en infants en implant coclear i farà una comparació en els casos en què els infants han estat exposats a la llengua oral o a la llengua de signes. I aquests resultats d'aquest treball els va publicar a la revista Pediatrics l'any 2017. Degut a la pandèmia, Geers ens farà la presentació de manera virtual i com que a més no podia estar disponible en aquest horari a Texas, ens van registrar aquesta ponència la setmana passada. Així que sense més, passem a la seva ponència titulada Impacte del mode d'exposició precoç del llenguatge en els beneficis de l'implant coclear.
My name is Geers. I'm at the University of Texas at Dallas, Texas, in St. Louis. And I'm going to be talking about data from the childhood development after cochlear implantation study, a large NIH-funded study of centers in the United States. The title of my talk is the impact of the mode of early language exposure on cochlear implant benefits. The motivation for this talk was a pediatrics article by Napoli et al. That appeared in 2015, Should All Deaf Children Learn Sign Language? And the conclusion was that the benefits of learning sign language clearly outweigh the risks. For parents and families who are willing and able, this approach seems clearly preferable to an approach that focuses solely on oral communication. Now, most of the parents of the deaf children, 95%, are normal hearing, and they would like their children to communicate using spoken language. And so since the advent of cochlear implantation, we decided to look and see what is the impact of sign language use by parents on cochlear implant benefit. The Childhood Development After Cochlear Implant study is a longitudinal study taking subjects from 6 centers in the United States that were identified between 2002 and 2004 and were tested annually thereafter. And these are the 6 centers across the United States. There were 188 children originally enrolled in the CDACI study. For this particular sample, we selected those children whose implant was activated by 38 months of age or earlier, and there was 137 such children. And then we also, of course, had to have families that on a questionnaire reported each year the mode of communication they were currently using with their child. So that reduced the N down to 129. And then we wanted to follow these kids at least through late elementary school grades. And so we looked for children out of this 129 who were tested in both early and late elementary school, and that brought our N to 97. So today, we'll be talking about 97 children. We divided these children into 3 sign language exposure groups. The first group, no sign was used either before the child was implanted or for the first 3 years following cochlear implantation. In the short-term sign language group, and there were 35 in that group, in the short-term sign language group, sign was used pre-implant and at the 12-month post-implant. So these are families that used sign for a little while to help get their children started. And then after the 12-month testing interval, they dropped sign. And then long-term sign users, and there were 36 of those, who were still using the sign at 36 months post-implant. We wanted to make sure that these 3 groups were statistically identical in terms of other factors that can predict outcomes. They did not differ in the percent of female participants, in household income, in what percentage of the mothers had graduated college, in the aided pure tone average better ear threshold prior to implantation, in terms of their age at onset of deafness, the age at which they first got a hearing aid, and the age at which their cochlear implant was activated. So these categories did not differ statistically significantly, and so we're going to assume that these are not variables that are going to be related to their outcome. We also had a system for evaluating maternal sensitivity to child's communication attempts, their nonverbal IQ, their beginning vocabulary, the number of words on the MacArthur-Bates Communicative Development Inventory that they had, and their pre-implant auditory perception. Again, no differences between the groups. So here are the outcomes that we're interested in measuring and comparing for the groups of kids who had no sign, short-term sign, or long-term sign exposure. We're interested in their speech perception. Here we're going to be looking at data from 1, 2, and 3 years post-implant, which is highly related to their speech intelligibility. That's how well normal hearing people who are not used to listening to deaf speech can understand them when they talk. And we measured this when they were 6, 7, or 8 years old. Then later on, we looked at their spoken language using the comprehensive assessment of spoken language. And we're going to look at results twice, one in early elementary grades when they were between 5 and 7 years old, and again in later elementary grades when they were between 9 and 11 years old. And the same for reading comprehension on the Woodcock-Johnson tests of achievement. At those same age ranges, we're interested to see what their reading comprehension turned out. So the first question we asked of these data was, does an early exclusive focus on spoken language promote faster development of auditory speech perception skills, leading to more intelligible speech in elementary grades? Now, we measured speech perception at the very beginning levels using parent report, moving on to closed set speech perception tests where the words are already pictured and the child simply identifies a word, and then to open set tests, which are the most difficult speech perception tests. And here we're looking at words and at sentences. Now, here's what the speech perception scores look like. That is just based on a standardized score assigned from this particular speech perception battery that I just described. And you can see at pre-implant, these are the dotted bar represents the scores of children who had no sign exposure. The Light blue bars represent those who had short-term sign exposure, and the dark blue bar represents those who had long-term sign exposure, 3 or more years. So we're looking at pre-implant, there's no difference. We've already seen that among those groups. By first year post-implant, they're all improving in their speech perception ability. This is the mean, this is the interquartile range. But there's really no difference in the means for those 3 groups. At 2 years post-implant, well, they're all progressing, but again, this difference, because of the huge variability, is not statistically significant. Now, when we get to 3 years post-implant, this difference between the no sign group and the long-term sign group, although small, reaches statistical significance. So there's some advantage by 3 years post-implant for those children whose parents did not use any sign at all. But it's relatively small for speech perception. They all had implants. They all got good benefit from their implant. Next, we looked at how well their speech could be understood using something called the McGar sentences. And we did this by recording children imitating the teacher, producing 3-syllable sentences, 5-syllable sentences, and 7-syllable sentences. And they were either high context, which means you could get the key word if you got any of the words in the sentence, read the book, and low context sentences, get the cake. The sentence does not give you any clue as to what that key word is. So we're scoring for listeners who are writing down everything they hear the child say in those sentences, and we're looking at how many keywords were understood. And here we begin to see a much bigger difference. The no sign group is close to 80% intelligible on average. They have highly intelligible speech. And the short-term sign group really does not differ from them. So kids whose parents signed to them pre-implant and maybe during the first year after implantation are just about as intelligible as those who use no sign at all. The long-term sign group, however, is significantly lower, being below 60% intelligible at 8 years of age. And of course, we're interested to see whether their early speech perception predicted speech intelligibility later. And so we did correlations between speech recognition and speech intelligibility. And although that was not significant, of course, at baseline pre-implant, it was significant, those correlations at every year. So perception is highly related to intelligibility. So in response to our first question, we found that children whose families use spoken language exclusively developed better auditory speech perception skills and had more intelligible speech than children whose families use sign for 3 or more years. The short-term sign use didn't appear to affect speech intelligibility or speech perception. Now let's move on to our second question to ask of these data. Does early exposure to sign language promote the development of spoken language and reading, which, after all, are the most important outcomes to a lot of parents? Comprehensive assessment of spoken language is a standardized instrument designed for normal hearing kids that looks at a whole variety of types of language structures. And we looked at the Woodcock-Johnson tests of achievement. We were focusing on passage comprehension, which at the very young ages in early elementary school is really the understanding of printed words. But later on, as reading develops, this test taps the ability to understand a paragraph, make inferences from what you read. So it gets more difficult, of course, as the age range moves up. So here I'm going to guide you through the language and reading results in all of these slides. Spoken language scores are going to be depicted on the left, reading scores on the right. And again, we've got our no sign group, our short-term sign group, and our long-term sign group. Now, 100 is the mean for normal hearing kids. And that is the story you would expect from a child that age who did not have a hearing loss. And you can see that some of these groups are getting well into the normal range. This is a standard deviation around the normal range. So we consider any standard score above 85 to be normal, within the normal range. Now, when we look at early elementary grades, kids who are 5 to 7 years old, and we're looking at their spoken language, we see that those kids who had no early sign exposure are just scoring, their average is right into the average range. Not the case for either the short-term or the long-term sign group who are below average. Now, this represents a significant delay in scores for those kids who continue to use sign after 3 years post-implant. And that delay continues into late elementary grades. So there appears to be a persisting language delay, whereas the kids in the no sign group are actually making extraordinary progress, so that by late elementary grades, they're scoring right where they're supposed to be for normal hearing kids the same age. Now let's look at reading. And it is also the case that those with short-term sign exposure show depression of scores in relation to the no sign group. So I don't know whether this is a real difference, but it indicates that there is some delay associated with kids whose parents signed for a short period of time before they received a cochlear implant and shortly thereafter. Now we'll look at reading scores, and here we can see that at the early ages where they're mostly reading words, all three groups are scored well within the average range. But when we get to reading paragraphs and making inferences from paragraphs, everybody is showing some decrement in performance. And we can see that the kids who continued signing are well below the average range in late elementary grades. So too are those who had short-term sign exposure. So there appears to be some, it's not just for language, but it's also for reading, where there is some depression for both of these groups in their scores. So in answer to question 2, early exposure to sign language did not enhance either spoken language or reading. And children whose parents signed were significantly more likely than children of non-signing parents to exhibit delays. So let's look at the third question that we posed. Is the quantity of sign language exposure over the first 3 years post-implant important for age-appropriate spoken language and reading development? So is how much sign you get during that period of time. Does it help you get there? And if we look at the percent of subjects scored below the average range, what we'd like to see is that this value going down with time. And we see that in the no sign group. So where about half of the kids were below average in language at the 5 to 7 year testing. By the 9 to 11 year testing, only about 30% are scoring below the average range. We can see that for the short-term sign group, there's about no change. We still see almost 60% of those kids with below average language. And for the long-term sign group, we see some decrement, but they're still have considerably higher rates of below average test scores. In reading, again, the very early ages when reading tests are not that challenging, not very many kids in any group are scoring below the average range. But by the late testing, by the time we're talking about 9, 10, 11-year-olds, these two groups, over 50%, remain below the average range for their age. So if we do that in terms of odd ratios, we see that in the early grades for language, those kids, these are both odds ratios expressed in relation to the no sign group. So whereas the short-term sign group is a little bit less likely to have a delay, more likely to have a delay, the long-term sign group was more than 3 times likely to have a delay in the early grades, and almost 4 times more likely than the no sign group to exhibit a language delay. And that is significant. And in reading, not significant at the early grades, but by the later grades, both of these groups approach 4 times more likely to exhibit a language delay than those kids who had no sign exposure at all. So children with sign language exposure, whether short-term or long-term, were at a significant disadvantage compared to those from non-signing families. By late elementary school, participants exposed to sign language were 3 to 4 times more likely to exhibit spoken language and reading comprehension delays relative to their hearing age mates. Now, I want to be sure that we interpret these data appropriately. Our study includes data from a representative sample of early implanted children reared in families all with hearing parents. These data exemplify real-world situations across the United States in which the majority of hearing parents typically lack proficiency in American Sign Language, or ASL. And therefore, they cannot provide the kind of language-rich environment that both ASL and English exposure could provide. So we did not test any of those children. They weren't in our sample. That being said, we grouped our participants based on sign exposure reported by the parents. And we did not systematically assess the parents' proficiency with what kind of sign. We did not evaluate what kind of sign, whether they're using signed English, ASL, what were they trying to sign. We have seen data from studies that have fluent ASL signing parents where the outcomes are quite remarkable for small samples. But of course, there's no control group, and we don't have the kind of large ends that we have in a study like this. And of course, we also have to point out that there's huge variability. There's big individual differences. And just whether or not you use sign, none of that, even having a cochlear implant, does not guarantee that children will score within the average range or develop normal language and reading. This just has to do with their probabilities of doing so. So our overall conclusion is that if the long-term development of oral communication and literacy is the primary objective for a child with a cochlear implant, a focus on early spoken input increases the probability of achieving those goals. And any of you that are interested in a more detailed presentation of data, these data, I refer you to the pediatrics article, Early Sign Language exposure and cochlear implant benefits that was published in Pediatrics in 2017. Thank you very much for your attention.